The sun had barely begun its climb over the vast Mojave horizon when the bandit rode through a stretch of dust and silence that seemed to stretch forever, a man of shadows whose name had been whispered across counties like a curse, Jesse Hale, an outlaw carved by hunger, guilt, and years of running from the law and from himself. He had seen men bleed out in the dust, towns burn for a few stolen dollars, and dreams dissolve in liquor bottles under the rusting roofs of forgotten bars. The desert was his last refuge, a barren cathedral where he believed God had long since turned his face away. That morning, Jesse's horse limped along a narrow ravine as wind carried heat through cracked stones, and it was there, through a shimmer of sand, that he saw her, a figure half collapsed near a wrecked jeep, a streak of blue fabric moving faintly like a trapped bird. At first, instinct told him to pass by. Mercy was a luxury he had long buried. But something in the stillness, the fragile outline of her body in the glare, tugged at him with a strange unease. He dismounted, cautious, revolver in hand, scanning the horizon for signs of an ambush. The desert didn't forgive fools. When he reached her, he found a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, her skin burnt by the sun, her lips cracked, a torn journal clutched against her chest. She looked too perfect for the wilderness, too refined, and that was why suspicion burned through him even as he poured a few drops of water on her tongue. She opened her eyes slowly, green like the rare shade of desert sage, and whispered something he couldn't hear. He carried her to a shaded rock and waited as the sun crawled overhead, the heat smothering the air. Hours later, when she could speak, she told him her name was Claire Dalton, a wildlife researcher who'd gone missing 3 days ago after her team's vehicle broke down during a sandstorm. Her story felt rehearsed, too calm for someone stranded and near death. Jesse didn't believe in coincidence. The desert taught that every stranger carried a purpose, and most of the time, it was to kill you. Still, he offered her food from his pack and said little, letting silence draw its own lines between them. As twilight fell, the wind shifted, bringing with it a haunting wail through the canyons. She watched him light a small fire and said softly that she knew who he was. His hand froze over the matchstick. Few people dared to say his name. She didn't flinch. Instead, she said she'd read about him years ago, the failed bank job in Tucson, the deputy left bleeding on the steps, the bounty that never stopped rising. Her voice carried no judgment, just a strange empathy, and that unsettled him more than hatred would have. He asked if she planned to turn him in once they reached a town. She smiled faintly and said she didn't think he'd make it to any town unless he stopped running from what had already caught him. That night, while she slept wrapped in his blanket, Jesse sat awake staring at the flicker of firelight over her face, wondering why she looked so peaceful in a place meant for ghosts. The desert hummed with secrets, and he began to suspect that saving her might have been the worst decision of his life. Over the next day, they traveled west toward a small canyon outpost. She limped but refused his help, always walking slightly ahead as if guiding him somewhere he couldn't yet see. She spoke of the desert's resilience, of animals that survived by adapting rather than fighting, and Jesse found himself listening even when he didn't want to. He realized he hadn't heard another person speak with such quiet conviction in years. Yet his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. When they reached the outpost, a cluster of rusted fuel pumps and a boarded-up motel, he noticed tracks in the sand, too neat, too deliberate. Someone had been waiting. That night, under a bruised sky, Jesse confronted her. She didn't deny it. She told him the truth, or what sounded like it. She said she wasn't just a researcher. She was working with a federal task force tracking illegal desert mining operations, and one of the men funding them was a smuggler Jesse had once robbed years ago. The smuggler wanted Jesse dead. The task force wanted him alive. She was the bait to draw him out. Her voice trembled not with fear but guilt. She hadn't expected him to save her. She hadn't expected the outlaw in the wanted posters to be a man haunted more by his conscience than his crimes. Jesse said nothing, only stared into the flames as old memories rose like ghosts. The deputy he shot, the woman he'd left behind, the child he never met. He had always believed he was beyond redemption, and maybe this was how fate planned to end it. Not in glory, but in betrayal. Still, when headlights glowed in the distance hours later, he didn't run. He told Claire to stay behind a rock, that he'd handle it. The convoy rolled up, 3 black SUVs kicking dust. Men stepped out, armed, methodical. They called his name through megaphones, promising leniency, promising lies. Jesse didn't believe them, but he also didn't want Claire caught in the crossfire. He walked out slowly, hands raised, the same desert wind that had witnessed every one of his sins now whispering through his hair. But then he heard a gun cock behind him. One of the agents, nervous, too eager, and instinct took over. A shot cracked the silence, grazing his shoulder. He dropped, rolled, fired twice, and chaos erupted. Bullets tore the air. Claire screamed his name, and in that instant Jesse realized what the trap truly was. It wasn't the agents or the guns, it was fate itself cornering him between survival and surrender. When the dust settled, two men lay wounded, and Jesse stood breathing hard, the weapon shaking in his hand. He could kill again, keep running, disappear deeper into the wasteland, but he looked back at Claire, tears streaking the dirt on her face, and something inside him finally broke. He dropped the gun. He woke in a hospital 3 days later, handcuffed to the bed, shoulder stitched, the steady beep of a monitor counting down the last of his old life. Claire sat by the window, her arm bandaged from a ricochet. She told him she'd spoken to the authorities, told them he'd saved her life, that he hadn't meant to fire first. It wasn't enough to erase his past, but it changed something. The district attorney offered a deal, information for leniency. For the first time in years, Jesse didn't feel the urge to lie. He told them everything. The smuggler routes, the stash points, the dead men's names. In return, they cut his sentence to 5 years. Claire visited often during those years, bringing books, letters, and photographs of the desert blooming after spring rains. He couldn't understand why she cared, but her visits became the only thing that made time move differently, softer somehow. When he was released, older and thinner, he stepped into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. The desert waited for him at the horizon, not as a hiding place but as a reminder of what he'd survived. Claire was there too, waiting beside an old truck, her hair caught in the wind. They drove in silence for hours until the city disappeared behind them and the world turned gold again. She told him she'd left the task force, that she was working on a project to protect endangered desert lands from illegal operations, the same kind he once helped destroy. She offered him a job, not as a guard or an informant, but as someone who knew the land, who understood how people survived when the world forgot them. He didn't answer right away. The desert didn't forget easily, and forgiveness was a word he didn't trust. But when they reached a dry riverbed blooming with wildflowers after the rains, he understood that maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about walking through it and still choosing to see beauty. Years later, Jesse Hale became something of a ghost legend again, not as a bandit but as the man who guided rescue teams through storms, who helped rebuild the ruins of towns swallowed by sand. People who met him said he carried a calm like the desert at dusk, quiet but endless. They said a woman often traveled with him, taking photographs, her laughter scattering like light over the dunes. No one recognized them as the outlaw and the agent who once trapped him. And that was how Jesse preferred it. Sometimes, when night stretched long and the stars trembled like mirrors over the sand, he would think back to that first morning. The heat, the broken jeep, the girl who had been both his downfall and his salvation. The desert had given him many enemies, but it had also given him one last chance to be human. He learned that not every trap is built to destroy, some are made to catch what's already falling and teach it how to land. And in that endless silence of the Mojave, where wind carried the ghosts of men who once believed they could outrun fate, Jesse Hale found peace, not by escaping the desert, but by finally belonging to it.